One of the most mind-blowing things about the Trump era is that roughly 8 in 10 white evangelical voters support MAGA. And this is a group of people whose faith teaches humility, sexual restraint, loving your foreign neighbor, and moral accountability. So it's extremely hard to reconcile that with Trump's rhetoric, his documented behavior, and what he's done while in office. And I know that some of you are probably thinking, I don't need a neuroscientist to explain this to me, because the explanation here is simple. It's hypocrisy. And for some people, that may be true, but psychology gives us a deeper explanation for why MAGA loyalty is so persistent, especially among the religious right. We need to understand that political disagreements often aren't about whether people care about morality. They're about what happens when moral values conflict. Take immigration, for example. Someone can feel compassion for families fleeing violence and, at the same time, feel a strong obligation to protect their own community or preserve national identity. And when this sort of value conflict happens, the value that wins depends on how someone ranks their moral priorities. Research in moral psychology shows that liberals and conservatives rely on many of the same moral foundations, including care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. But they weight these differently. While liberals tend to emphasize care and fairness more heavily, conservatives tend to emphasize loyalty, authority, and purity more heavily. But there's also something else important going on here, because sometimes a value moves from important to non-negotiable. In psychology, these are called sacred values, and these values aren't processed like simple policy preferences. They're processed more like moral rules. Studies show that people will refuse large sums of money rather than violate a sacred value. And neuroimaging shows that when people think about sacred values, brain regions involved in rule-based judgment become more active than those involved in cost-benefit calculation. In other words, sacred values aren't debated. They're defended as moral absolutes. For many white evangelicals, abortion has long functioned as a sacred value, and transgender rights are increasingly framed the same way. Sustained political and religious messaging has cast these issues as moral absolutes rather than policy debates, making them feel urgent and beyond compromise. And once an issue reaches sacred status, the question shifts from, is Trump virtuous, to will Trump defend what I believe must be protected at all costs? When abandoning a leader would mean jeopardizing a sacred value, the brain works to rationalize continued loyalty. Within this framework, loyalty to Trump isn't irrational or even necessarily hypocritical. It reflects a structured hierarchy of moral priorities shaped by decades of political and religious messaging. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, the full piece is on my Substack. You can find the link in my bio.